It's a great pleasure to welcome Guglielmo here, and it's probably fair to say that Guglielmo is one of the most prominent scholars in European industrial relations over the last decades, both from a comparative point of view, looking at different national context, country context, as well as from a transnational point of view. So he has published extensively, not only about the implications of European Union legislation and membership for industrial relations in different countries, but also about the implications of the rising importance of multinational firms and another important issue that is very rarely treated by industrial relations researchers, the impact of cross-border migration on industrial relations. And it's also actually, I think, fairly fair to say that Guglielmo is one of the very few truly pan-European intellectuals, I would say, who not only has many languages in his CV, but actually manages to speak them as well, and so he actually is one of the few who manages to read and speak at least 6, if not more, European languages, and spanning, which is rarely the case, actually, the East-West divide, with a perfect command of Polish, I suppose, in the least. Now, and this brings us already close to what he is going to present today, because he has, because of this pan-European nature of his work, always been interested also in this region, Central and Eastern Europe. And his most recent book, which is here, in case you are interested, I will leave it here, or we can circulate it. Social Failures of EU Enlargement. He engages with the implications of European Union enlargement for the situation of workers and industrial relations in this region of the continent. And without further ado, I therefore give the floor to Guglielmo, and we have his presentation for about 40 minutes with question and answers following. Please.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. There was maybe a marginal part of truth in what you said, but some residual truths. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I often have to talk about these things to people who know hardly anything about Central Europe, while here I play away in a way, because you know more than I do, and it can be a bit more interesting for me. It's a different experience in a way than talking about it in Italy or in France or in Britain. So it's really a big pleasure for me to be here. I've been a couple of times to Hungary for research. That was about 8-9 years ago, and then a couple of times again. It's always very, very interesting, and it's nice to see so many people that seem interested in this topic. It's fascinating. I hope there will be questions. Don't be afraid of criticizing me, and I actually will finish my presentation by trying to answer to some criticism which has been raised on my arguments, which have made me think more about how to formulate my conclusions. And any more criticism is really welcome. If you don't understand anything I'm saying, because it is true I speak many languages, but I don't speak any language well. So that is the problem. The quantity is not too bad. The quality could be better. So, and I tend to speak very fast. So if you don't understand what I say, please stop me, and I will gesticulate. We will understand each other. I don't know how much you can see. But probably it's fine. So let's start. I'm very sorry, you needed the publicity of the research group. Yeah, the topic of my presentation is really drawing, a summary of my book, and then a little update, because the book came out last year, and obviously the research had been done before last year, because we academics, we are terribly slow. And therefore there will be a little update about how to revisit these arguments in 2013, and some answer to some criticism which has been raised on my argument. The topic is what the enlargement means for social Europe. The title of the book is a bit more provocative, failures or social failures of the European enlargement. Well, to start with, what do we mean for social Europe? I refer to the broad literature on the European social model. Just in order to understand each other, what do I mean for the European social model? There are two definitions. The analytical one, which has been proposed among others by Ferreira, Hemmerich and Rhodes, states that Western Europe is different from the other largest capitalist economies, that is Japan on one side and the United States of America on the other side, on a couple of indicators. In particular, Western Europe has a higher level of coordination of wage policies, notably collective bargaining, has rights of information and consultation in the workplace for employees, and it has a universal welfare state. The effect of this is there is less inequality. Because of these institutions, there is less inequality in the European Union, in comparison to Japan, in comparison to the US, and of course in comparison to Latin America. And there is, however, also a normative meaning of the European social model. It is not what Europe is, but what Europe should be. And this was proposed first by Jacques Delors more than 20 years ago. And it refers to the social dimension of the European single market, and it refers to some policies that the European Union has in order to protect certain social institutions and even to develop even further certain social aspects of the economy in Europe. This involves in particular regulation of health and safety at work, equal opportunities, and so on. These are the two main success stories of social Europe. There is a bit of literature on that. I will refer to both of these meanings. That is how Central Eastern Europe is a bit different from Western Europe, but rather than just saying that, which is obvious, I would say it is not really going in the same direction. And therefore, it affects the second of these meanings, that is the normative ones. It's not trying to go towards the same goals as it was proposed by Jacques Delors 20 years ago. Where does my story come from? It comes from a number of different streams of research. First of all, some case studies of multinational companies in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, and in Slovenia, which are carried out between 2004 and 2008. That is immediately after the European Union enlargement. It also comes from a study at macro level of Polish tripartism and the Polish Tripartite Commission. A case study of Polish migrants in the UK, and analysis of the secondary literature, data, and so on. So, now, my provocation is that not only Central Eastern Europe is different from Western Europe, but the gap between the two, instead of narrowing, as it was implicitly promised with the European enlargement, is actually in many regards enlarging. Not in all aspects, but in some important aspects. Well, let's start with industrial relations, which is what I know best. Unionization, there wasn't such a big difference in 98. 98 is when the accession negotiations start. It was already larger in 2003. It becomes even larger in 2008. That is, the decline of unionization that happens everywhere. In Western Europe, it's very, very slow. In Central Europe, it falls very, very sharp. And therefore, the gap actually increases. Collective bargaining, the same story. In Western Europe, it declines very slowly. In Central Eastern Europe, it declines in relative terms a bit faster, and therefore in relative terms the gap becomes more visible rather than less visible. And labor law, employment protection law, that is the role of the state and legislation to protect the negotiation power of employees by making dismissals difficult. Here there is a little bit of convergence, okay? That is from 98 to 2008, the legislation has increased the protection of employees in most new member states, whereas this has declined in Western Europe. I would, however, notice that the convergence is more towards the Central Eastern Europe than towards Western Europe. Okay, so there is some convergence here, but it's slightly more towards the east than towards the west. And this stops in 2008. It will be much worse, the situation, if we included the recent structural reforms in many Western European countries. And finally, social expenditure, that is the role of the welfare state in protecting, in a way, the livelihood of workers by making a part of their life, their subsistence, meaning independent from the employment condition, that is, getting some social rights regardless of whether you have money or not, what Spingardersen calls decommodification. And here, well, again, social expenditure falls a little bit, but actually falls slightly faster in Central Eastern Europe and in Western Europe, and therefore, again, in relative terms, the gap, if at all, it increases a little bit rather than narrowing down. I repeat, and on all these things, my main focus is the trend. That is, I'm not criticizing the European Union for this difference. This is not the fault of the European Union. The same all the other indicators. If Central Eastern Europe, in a way, socially doesn't have the same institution of Western Europe, it is because of history, and we can also name who was responsible, but we know it. What I'm interested in is the trend, that there is actually no convergence in these dimensions. And the effect of this is that poverty, despite an increase in, these are the data from 2007, as far as I remember, poverty, instead of diminishing, is actually increasing. The economy is doing not too badly. It depends on the country, really. The country I visit most is Poland, and they are relatively proud of their economic situation. Hungary, probably a little bit less. But still, it's better than Greece. So economically, we could say, well, it's even a success to some extent. It depends which country you look at. But socially, well, not really very much. And interestingly, the poverty risk has a very different distribution by age than in Western Europe. Okay? This is the European Union as a whole, and these are the three models of the welfare state, the three post-communist worlds of welfare, to imitate the terms of Spingardersen, which I would define as the good, the bad, and the ugly. That is, Hungary is not too bad, Poland is baddish, and Estonia is a bit of a disaster. And the three columns are the age groups: the young, middle age, and retirement age. In Western Europe, the people who are at most risk of poverty are people who are a little bit older, okay? And in Central Eastern Europe, except in Estonia and all the other Baltic states where pensions are very low, in the other ones, actually pensions are relatively not too bad. Remember, poverty is calculated with reference to the national average. So it doesn't mean that Hungarians are richer than the Germans. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that elderly people in Hungary, in relation to the national average in Hungary, are at less risk of poverty than most Western Europeans, especially in Britain, but also in many other countries of Western Europe. And this is because people who are retired are probably not very rich, but they have benefited from the previous system. They probably worked all their life with very little unemployment. They probably had housing inherited from the communist state. And they have pensions which in Hungary and Poland were set at levels which at least allow subsistence, unlike, for instance, in the UK. By contrast, if you look at young people, they are a much higher risk of poverty than in Western Europe. And this is because, well, most of the people here are young, and they don't benefit from secure employment, from good benefits, or from helps for housing. And why is this interesting? Because for employment relations, well, what matters is who enters the labor market. And who enters the labor market now in Central Eastern Europe has very little negotiation power, because either you get a job or you have basically nothing. You have to accept employment conditions that in other countries you would think twice about accepting or not. What is the link more specifically between the enlargement and the social dimension of the European Union? Well, the easiest one institutionally is the so-called acquis communautaire. That is the fact that the legislation of the European Union had to be implemented in all new member states, otherwise they could not be accepted in the European Union. Now, if we look at the social acquis communautaire, that is the social regulations, we find a couple of cases where the transposition of directives did not benefit employment conditions, but actually in some cases had perverse effects. Well, one case which Laszlo Neumann knows better than I do in the Hungarian case, but it's quite similar in a couple of other countries, including Poland. The Working Time Directive, which is, if you go to Britain, is the symbol of excessive European regulations that protect workers and prevents companies to do what they could do, actually allowed the new member states to change the previous legislation and increase the amount of flexible working time, because you can distribute the computation, the calculation of working hours over a longer period. On information and consultation of employees, something like that was happening. That is, the Directive on Information and Consultation of Employees introduced by the European Union in 2002, in a way, imposed the creation of some forms of employee representation in the workplaces. But what many of the governments in this region have done, especially in the Baltics, but also Czech and Slovak governments and the Polish government tried to do, was to introduce new channels which would have undermined the trade unions, made the trade unions redundant, but these new channels would have very, very little rights. So there will be the replacement of a channel which didn't work very well with a channel which worked probably even less. All these attempts were somehow stopped, and finally what has happened is very little changed. But if something had changed, actually probably would have been for the worse rather than for the better. There have been some positive effects, okay? I'm not going to say that it is all black and everything is a disaster. Some positive effects in, see there is a spelling mistake, sorry, on equal opportunities, where the legislation changed, and as an effect, quite quickly also the awareness of certain issues of indirect discrimination, harassment, and so on has clearly increased across the region. European Works Council, for the few employees who are covered by European Works Council, obviously are an improvement. Yeah? They add some more, Thomas is more of an expert about that. They allow, if you use it well, some degree of access to headquarter management and some possibility for negotiations. Then, in addition to the hard acquis communautaire, that is the legislation, the directives, what you have to introduce, there is the so-called soft acquis communautaire. That is the coordination policies, which the European Union uses more and more, because they find it more and more difficult to pass directives, to find the agreement of 27 countries. So they use rather the open method of coordination. And this includes employment policies, includes social dialogue. And although around 2004, there had been a time where some experts were thinking, well, probably the European Union will promote the use of tripartite negotiation, the so-called social pacts, which at the time were popular in Western Europe. That hasn't really happened. Actually, in the country where there were more social pacts, to some extent even Hungary would be one example like that, but certainly Slovenia, they stopped after they entered the European Union. So the effect was rather negative instead of positive. And the European employment strategy, which requires every country to prepare an employment plan or an employment reform plan now every year, and requires to discuss it through social dialogue, again, it had only an effect on paper. That is, the negotiations of the employment policies actually are purely formal, rather than really substantial discussion between the government, the employers, and the trade unions about employment policies. So again, the effect is quite poor. Indirectly, there have been more important effects, but these have gone in another direction. there are the effects of the economic and monetary union, which now is a bit of it's difficult to talk about it because it changes all the time, it is in crisis and so on. But certainly the criteria of Maastricht, which still on paper exist, they exist only on paper because you can't really say that anybody respects them anymore. But in theory, if you want to enter the euro, you have to respect them. They certainly don't increase the space for social policies. They reduce it. You have to keep inflation down, you have to keep expenditure down, and so on. Deregulation, privatization, especially in Slovenia, but in general the fact that more competition has been introduced, it has dismantled certain forms of regulation which existed before without replacing them with alternative forms of regulation. And one can even use a sort of a contrario confirmation. That is, if the European Union had a positive effect on the social dimension, then you should see that the most pro-European governments in the regions, the governments which are most enthusiastic about complying with European policies, they would be those which improve social policies and social standards the most. Actually, what has happened has been the opposite. The only governments, and really here I'm not giving a judgment about the quality of governments, okay? I'm not saying that some politicians are better than others, some parties are better than others. I just say look at the social legislation. The rest of the legislation is a completely different discourse. The only ones which really try to improve, certainly not decrease employee prerogatives, but actually improve some of them, were the Eurosceptical governments of Poland in 2005-2007, the only government in the history of Poland which didn't deregulate labor law. For 2 years there was a break. They didn't liberalize labor legislation. And the Slovak government of 2000 and that was 2004-2008, the first Fico government. Maybe this also applies to the current Hungarian government, but this is something you know better than I do, so I wouldn't enter in any detail about this. And labor conditions as an effect. I mean, if health and safety regulation, which clearly has changed on paper, had improved labor conditions in this region, then there should be probably some effect on accidents at work. Now, these are very difficult things to compare, okay? Because every country collects information a little bit differently. So sometimes you see there are more accidents in Sweden than in Italy. The reason is only that in Sweden they count them and in Italy they don't. But here I'm interested in the trend, okay? So let's put at 100, sorry, you can't really see the numbers, but it's from 1998 to 2006. So let's put at 100 1998. And in all countries, there's the good news, fatal accidents at work decline slowly. Not necessarily because the legislation improves or because labor conditions improve, just for structural economic reasons. It is more difficult to die in an office than in a mine, okay? So because certain sectors of the economy are shrinking and other sectors are increasing. I mean, I think this room is quite safe, for instance. We die a little bit less than our parents or grandparents. However, look at the trend. The black is the Western Europe, and the dotted line is the new member state. The decline is faster in Western Europe than in new member states. So again, the gap, instead of narrowing, is actually widening. And Western Europe has had health and safety regulation from the 80s, and the new member states which have introduced it now, especially in the first period, they didn't really, this is the time when they started changing the legislation. Okay, 98 was the beginning of the accession negotiation, and legislation started to change from 98, not from 2004. And the trend wasn't really particularly good. Even the trend is slightly worse than countries which didn't enter the European Union. Here the comparison is even more difficult, so I don't want to reach an easy conclusion. But in Russia, the Ukraine and Belarus, not countries which are perfect in many regards, actually it seems that the decline of accidents is faster than in new member states. They didn't enter the European Union, they didn't introduce anything from the acquis communautaire. In the case of social dialogue, well, it didn't really improve. In the case I studied most closely is the Polish one. And some people in Western Europe, they think, oh, well, social dialogue doesn't work and we shouldn't be really very fussy about it because these countries have no tradition of negotiations. So how can you expect them? You know, they have to learn. You know, it's already 20, 25 years and they still have to learn. However, if you look at the Polish history, of course there have been big problems. Right? It's not that they are unable to negotiate. In 1998, they negotiated a very big agreement. That was Lech Wałęsa, I don't know how visible it is, with the Deputy Prime Minister Jagielski in 1980. So they were able to sign an agreement in 1980. It's not that they were anthropologically unable to talk to each other. In 1989, they even sat around a round table for a month and they completely changed the institution without any need for fights. You can criticize that form of exit from communism, but certainly it was a negotiated one. And there were on one side the trade unions, on the other side the government. There were no employers at the time, but it's okay. And this is 2005, okay? I don't know how visible it is, it's a bit too much light, but this is the negotiation between the miners' trade unions and the Polish government in 2005. Obviously, I mean, it's a bit of selective, this example. You obviously can find much worse violence in the 80s than now, but what I mean is that you cannot explain this by this, okay? You cannot explain this by the past. There is something else happening. What else? The other thing I studied is another indirect way which many people hoped that would have helped social standards in the new member state. That is the effect of foreign direct investment. And I spent a little bit of time, including here in Hungary, doing case studies with Laszlo also helped a little bit at a certain time. And really, foreign direct investors, there was some hope that they would transfer the production model from Western Europe, a production model which included a social dimension, negotiations, consultation, treating employees well, the stability of the employment contract and so on. Actually, most companies from Germany and Austria, which are prominent investors in this region, they seek functional equivalents to their Western models. So instead of having the Works Council, collective bargaining, permanent contracts, a lot of training and so on, they use rather their strong market power of being able to select employees thanks to a better negotiation power, in particular high unemployment in certain regions. They use paternalism, so they go back to management models which date back from before the European social model. And they use bonuses. They use the economic incentive very quickly rather than negotiation with employees. The European Works Council themselves, they are only effective in very few large integrated multinational companies. In the majority of them, the trade unions or employee representatives don't have the resources to manage a real structure of continuous flow of information. Therefore, they meet once or twice per year, but that is really not enough to have an effect on industrial relations. And the Directive of Information and Consultation, if you look at multinational companies, they hardly know what it is. I found one or two companies that they knew it, and it is because they had created some sort of employee forum to keep the trade union outside. So that even in that case, it was not really an improvement, I would say, of representation. So what has happened for a while is that especially Western European companies have managed to find a new production model in this region which doesn't include the social one. In a way, they caused the problem to the German trade unions, because the German trade unions have long said the German model can only work with the social dimension. It's an integral part, together with the technology and the work organization, that is the social dimension. And suddenly you see the German companies which are as efficient or even more efficient in countries where the social bit they don't really follow it. One problem is that maybe that system works very well for a few years, but it may not be sustainable in the long term. Still difficult to say, because these things work on a long term. I think it is still impossible to give a clear answer about whether it is sustainable or not. But certainly the latest of my research, which was around 2008 in the Czech Republic, showed that, for instance, turnover was a big problem for multinational companies. Rotation of employees was too high, and they were trying to find other ways to manage employees. In general, this development can be looked at through the lens of Hirschman's typology of exit and voice as ways to deal with problems in organizations and in society. Exit is the market behavior. You don't like something, you quit. You don't like a product, you buy another one. You don't like a job, you leave, you go to another company, and so on. And voice is you have a problem, you sit down, and you try to solve the problem where you are. Each society has a little bit of both, but the combinations are quite different. And the pattern which has been promoted in the new member state is clearly exit rather than voice. That is, the political institutions have not been created, and it has been told, well, the market means choice, and therefore if you are unhappy, well, you are free to go somewhere else. And in practice, what does this mean? Well, it means that unlike some triumphalistic views that things are all getting better, if you look at the European Working Conditions Service, employees are not more happy than in Western Europe. They are really not. They are significantly less happy with their working conditions. But they protest less, and they organize less about it. How do we explain this? We explain this by pointing at the fact that they tend to react through exit. And this can take a number of different forms. Bela Greskovic had already identified some of them in the 90s. They exit from the labor market, so that was especially in the 90s. They try to get early retirement. I don't want to work, I try to find another way to survive. The return to family relation and family solidarity. In many countries, the employment levels of women has fallen in the 90s. Although now it is increasing again. Informal economy, although less in the Czech, there are differences here. In the Czech and Slovak republics, there is very little informal economy, actually. Politically, it is also visible that social issues are not really prominent in the political debate in these regions. And people tend to react through either protest vote sometimes, or electoral abstention. That is, the participation in election is much lower than in Western Europe. In a way, it is similar to America. So you can't say it is that Central Eastern Europe is behind Western Europe. Maybe it is ahead of Western Europe. It is already at American levels, and Western Europe is only slowly adapting to an American model. And then there is migration. That is, it affects Hungary obviously much less than Slovakia, Poland, Romania, a little bit starting now, but certainly still less than Poland, Slovakia, the Baltics, and Romania. But it has been large, it's been much larger than it was expected. Okay, and there are also informal protests and other forms of disloyalty in organizations. The fact that the employers are so concerned in the legislative reforms in this region with the issue of non-competition, that is, employees should be forbidden to work with competitors, which exists everywhere, but it's not nowhere in Western Europe is such a big issue. But clearly in Western Europe, in Central Eastern Europe, employers feel that the risk of employees working for competition and even taking information with them and so on is much higher than in Western Europe. Migration is the most visible of those aspects. And I looked a little bit at the Polish migration, which is the largest, the most visible, let's say, of this movement. And it has a symbolism in a way of what it means for Europe. You may already know this because they are quite old, these pictures, but even the Polish tourist office used the Polish plumber as a symbol, as a advertising for Polish tourism. But this means that it is so well known, the issue of the Polish plumber, everywhere. This is in French, but they used it also in other countries. That it is visible everywhere. It became a symbol of somebody who comes and works for a cheaper price, even if actually there aren't really many Polish plumbers, but it doesn't matter. And there is also, this is not me, okay, this has been criticized, it's not me who took this picture, it's only material, okay, it's the data, it's not my point. This is the Polish tourist office also having the female version, that is the Polish nurse so I don't criticize, but this may mean that in terms of political correctness, there is also a difference between the new and the old member states. But also it has a political impact. It became such a big issue in the UK, in the country where I lived. You may remember this person to the left. It was Tony Blair, if you remember him. To the right, you may not remember, it was Ruth Kelly. She was Minister for Immigration. And Tony Blair asked, what are we going to do about immigration? I will get a Polish bloke in to sort it out. Which is a joke, but actually it is truth. In order to face increased immigration, the UK had to appoint many more people for the border police. And there's nobody in the UK who wants to do this job, so they had to recruit from abroad. So they had to get immigrants to reduce the number of immigrants. But it really had a big effect on all the political discussion about welfare state and the labour market in the UK, and the way the current government, not Tony Blair anymore, in the UK can attack the welfare state so much now, more than Margaret Thatcher did in the 80s, is also in part thanks to the migration argument. Say, well, we can't afford it because otherwise all Romanians come here, so we have to close it for everybody, otherwise Romanians come here. What is interesting of intra-European Union migration? Not against migration, okay? Because I'm a migrant myself, so not against myself. It's all fine, and probably half of the migration flows is probably very good for everybody's winning. But there is half of these 2-3 million people who are moving who actually probably should have been given other choices, or at least they should have been given more rights. What characterizes the intra-European Union flow of migrants is very high flexibility and very high insecurity, employment insecurity. Particularly, this takes different forms in different countries, depending on the regulations, which are very different. In the UK, it takes, for instance, the form of agency work. Only 3% of British people find a job through an agency. About 30% of Polish workers find jobs through agency, and agency workers in the UK basically have absolutely no rights. That is, they can be fired at any time, so even basic rights like in the case of pregnancy, agency workers don't have it. And there have been some policy reactions, some official documents which really, there has also been a trend of de-skilling, that is, people not really benefiting from the visit, but losing the skills they had, wasting their skills, and an issue of care drain, that is, especially in the case of female migration. There have been some policy documents which really point to something which we can try to call social dumping. Social dumping is a concept which is very difficult to define. Magda is trying to do it. So I've really struggled to find a good definition of social dumping in theoretical terms. But then I run into a document of the Home Office of 2006. Home Office is the Interior Minister of the UK, saying that the more favourable, it is a document saying how good the migrants are. It's all about the positive sides of immigration from the new member state. And says the more favourable work ethic of migrant workers had the effect of encouraging domestic workers to work harder. And this is probably the best definition of social dumping that I've ever found. I mean, so it's not probably voluntary. So the effect is not really having some employees who work very hard, and they're free to work very hard, but it's the fact that they have a knock-on effect on the other employees, and they change the working condition of everybody else. And here there is a link between the voice and the exit issue. That is, obviously countries are different, and strangely enough, we can discuss the position of individual countries, but I think the association holds even if you remove one or two of them. In some countries, unionization has collapsed faster than in others. In some countries, emigration has been faster than others. I'm not saying that there is a direct connection, that is, that those who emigrate are the union members and therefore unionization falls. Not saying that people emigrate because they're unhappy with the trade unions. This is not the main reason why people emigrate, okay? If you ask them, oh, I don't like Liga and therefore I leave Hungary. I mean, that's not a good reason. But what happens, it seems that there is an association between how many channels you have to be listened to in the workplace and in society, in your society,
and the likelihood that you think about alternative options such as taking a cheap flight and going to Ireland or the UK. And in Slovenia, there has been basically no immigration, Hungary, less, and if you go to Latvia and Slovakia, it has been particularly high. So I'm not saying there is a direct link, there are the two sides of the same coin. Voice being weak, where voice is particularly weak, exit is particularly high. There are two sides of the same coin, not one causing the other. And the same with politics, that is in the fall of participation in the election is particularly fast in countries where immigration has been quite high, and everywhere, especially in European election. If European Union really had worked so fantastically, I think people would vote at the European elections, and they don't. Hungary is not even too bad, but look at Lithuania, 21%, Slovakia 19.6%. People don't even know what European elections are. And these are the countries where immigration is the fastest. Even at the level of organization, if we look at, I have to finish probably, speaking too long. I'll be a bit quicker now. So I want to get to the new thing. This is all in the book, so you can read it in the book. I can be fast. It's terribly expensive, but maybe one day there will be the paperback, hopefully soon. Turnover in companies is a big problem. Legal litigation as rather than a representative way to solve problems at work, go to court. Informal resistance, which are detected in many of the companies we were studying, and informal economy that is finding other way to improve your livelihood. There had been a period when I was quite optimistic. That was 2007, 2008. Because migration has been so big, one aspect of migration had been causing labor shortages. In Poland, unemployment collapsed from 21 to about 9% in only a couple of years. In some sectors, this led to labor shortages. This completely changed the negotiation power of employees towards employers, and suddenly employees could, in a way, dictate conditions, say, either you pay me more or I can go to Britain. And this was, in a way, it was not the best way to solve social issues, but indirectly it offered a channel for employees. And if you look at the assertiveness of Polish trade unions, there were 400 hours of strikes in the whole of Poland, 400 days of strike in the whole of Poland in 2004. That basically means in a country of 40 million people, there was one person in strike for the whole year out of 40 million. So basically no strikes at all. And they increased by nearly 1,000 times by 2008. So clearly they had more courage to protest. And there were quite a lot of examples like this in all other countries. However, it stopped from 2008 because of the crisis. So that was something that changed. But certainly, if there is one thing where there has been convergence, is strikes. That is, in the West, it has declined a little bit, and in most of the member states, Hungary and Poland in particular, it has a little bit increased. So overall, not so many strikes, but the big difference which existed in the past is not anymore. There are some consequences for Western Europe. I already mentioned the tension on migration, fears about free movement of services, and more and more threats by multinational companies. A company in my country, Fiat, in particular, managed to change completely the trade union representation system by threatening relocation to Poland. So this is the conclusion. There is an ambiguous link between exit and voice, but it's not because employees don't do anything or they are somehow anthropologically behind. Maybe the situation of 2008 was similar to 68, and therefore there will be then some protest when growth stops, but this hasn't really happened anymore. But certainly the possibility of shifts between voice and exit, which is well known in social theory, might happen in this region as well. Now, if I can have 2 minutes just on also that was something I was thinking and writing about 2-3 years ago. The crisis, my book was not about the crisis, okay, because most of the research I finished it in 2008. The crisis, in a way, shows the fragility of the model of the new member state. You attract a lot of foreign investment, it's quite good in the short term, but you have absolutely no guarantee that that will remain for a while. So paradoxically, now Fiat, after having obtained a change in Italy, is now reducing employment more in Poland than in Italy, because it's so easy to fire employees in Poland. They don't need really the support of the government. They do what they like. The government will always be friendly to foreign companies in Poland. They don't have anything to lose. Well, they may lose something in Italy. The same Siemens is reducing more the workforce in the Czech Republic than in Germany. The same Renault was reducing more in Romania and Slovenia than in France, and so on. So the fact of not having political structures, it may actually be a danger when things are not going very well. In some cases, there is even a vicious circle of this development. Latvia, which is an extreme case, the economy completely collapsed. And what collapsed was in particular house prices, because there had been so much speculation with so many immigrants away. What do migrants do with their money? Usually they buy a house at home. So a lot of people were buying houses they didn't need in Latvia. Prices have gone up and then completely collapsed by, in some cases, 50–60%. So what happened is they introduced more austerity, and they worsened even more the situation, and immigration even increased from Latvia. Immigration to the UK and Ireland is falling because of the crisis in Britain and in Ireland. There is only one nationality from where it is still increasing. From Latvia, they keep coming every year more than the year before. I wonder whether there's still somebody in Latvia, because it's despite the situation clearly in the UK being worse and worse, in Latvia it has worse and even worse. So in a way, there's a vicious circle of going even further on that model. Slovenia is another extreme level. On the other side, a country which had corporative structure, they've been undermined, and now they are about to fall under the troika. And so on. So, and there is the democratic legitimation of the EU. It's mostly because of the euro, so I can't really say it is because of the enlargement, but certainly that trend of focusing more and more on the market, which in the short term can be very efficient, it can work and produce wealth, but doesn't produce an institution to solve problems, may actually over time undermine the resources on which the market is built. Markets need trust. If you undermine trust because people never talk to each other, then eventually even the market will decline. A couple of people disagree with me. Okay, can I say that? Otherwise, I avoid it. I pretend everybody agrees with me. Okay, but for instance, they are not here, but Magda Bernacek, who will land later, and Dorothy Bohle, whom probably all of you know.
You later.
Yeah, maybe she's on the phone. They pointed to the fact that they paid little attention to intra-regional difference. I make a big soup, a goulash soup with a lot of ingredients, a bit of vegetables, of meat, and it's tasty, but you know, it's a bit heterogeneous. This is true. I mean, and certainly some words like Dorotheus on the varieties of capitalism is very, very important. However, most of the differences in this region are due to the previous parts, not really to what is happening now. To either the way they exit communism, the theory of Laszlo Brust and David Stark, or the communist legacies themselves, or even geopolitical situation, that is, more agriculture in certain countries, less agriculture in other ones. It's not really because of the EU. What I'm interested in is not the countries being different or similar, but the fact that the trend is basically the same. It's basically the same. I mean, Slovenia obviously was much, much better than Latvia, but in all two countries, in both countries, there have been the same trend towards worse social conditions. Other criticism, Michael Gold and Dorothy Bohle again, they say, well, how can it be a failure if nothing had been promised? The European Union only had promised free trade and not really better social conditions. In part, this is true, okay? The social aspect was not central in the enlargement. However, it was there. And there were some promises. This is my fault not having put that in the book. But if we go back, there had been a report by Amato for the European Commission in 1999 saying that it dealt with the social problems, and it says, well, first of all, there is no real poverty in Central Europe. They use the data in an amazing way to make all the poor people disappear. I mean, it's unbelievable what they managed to do. And, but also they say, well, there will be economic growth and this will foster social convergence, okay? So they thought that social convergence will happen automatically thanks to economic growth. Boer and Brücker, their famous report in 2001 on migration, saying there will be no migration because when Spain entered the European Union, there was no migration. Therefore, from Latvia, there won't be any migration, okay? How to extrapolate from one historical event, put it out of context and get the wrong conclusion. But again, they foresaw that there will be no social problem and no reason why employees should want to go to Western Europe. And most importantly of all, the report by Koch for the European Council in 2003 on the social models of the European Union, it discusses the issue of social dumping, and it says that the fears are overstated. Because a part of joining the EU is the adoption of a process of social dialogue and measures of social regulations. Therefore, because they are in the acquis communautaire, by definition, the problem will disappear. Also, it deals specifically with the issue of wages. And it says, well, there is no problem of social dumping because wages will increase faster than in Western Europe, and even unit labor cost gap will reduce. That is, the gap in unit labor costs will narrow down. And it even says that politically this is what should happen. It says the policy at both the European Union and national level should encourage wage growth, by which they mean unit labor cost, okay? Wage by productivity in the new member states. So that the gap disappears and there are no tension, no competition. That was the promise, and this is the reality. These are unit labor costs in Europe. These are the 6 largest countries in the European Union, which I'm studying now for a different project and a different book, okay? This table is always shown now for the Euro regions. So now I added the UK and Poland, and there are unit labor costs and whether they've gone up and down. Everybody knows Germany, they go down because they're very productive and they keep wages down, while in Italy and Spain it's a disaster because people are lazy, okay? But few people think about what happened in the UK and in Poland. First of all, the UK went also up. So it's not a matter of social regulations and collective bargaining. But most importantly, the country where unit labor costs have fallen most among the large economies in the European Union is Poland. Okay? So the country which had to converge actually has decreased. And therefore the gap in unit labor costs between Poland and all the large economies in Western Europe actually has increased. Exactly the opposite of what Koch had promised. Finally, Magda Bernacek also points to another mistake. She says, well, there are structural limits to the social policies in the new member states. Your expectations are too high. And in a way, she is right. In order to make my provocative point of a failure, I put the benchmark of a success relatively high, okay? And nobody, could expect really the European Union have delivered very much. However, my point, again, is not that Central Eastern Europe is poorer than the West. That is not the fault of Brussels. My point is that the trend is not of convergence. So I'm not saying that Poland or the Czech Republic should have the same welfare state as Sweden. I only say social expenditure in the Czech Republic shouldn't fall. That is the problem. This is the trend which I'm concerned with. The most critical person has been certain Stephens, who is a consultant of the European Commission, and a review in the Journal of Common Market Studies, saying I'm completely wrong because the social acquis communautaire was introduced in the legislation in the new member states, which proves that the European Commission, the European Union paid a lot of attention to social issues, which is true, but the fact that you I know that as an Italian, you may have a very good law and still things don't change. My point is that I look at the acquis communautaire, true, all directives have been transposed, but mostly they have become dead letters. And Dorothee, finally, she says that I may have a Polish bias, I speak too much about Poland, and forget that many countries are different. I recognize this as a mistake. The only, in a way, the only defense I can say, of all bias I could have, that is not too bad. Because if my point is saying that there has been a failure, and my bias is taking the only country where the economy has grown non-stop for the whole period, in a way that strengthens my case. If I had used Romania or Latvia or even Hungary, it would have been much easier for me to make the case. So for all bias, it's bad to have a bias. I recognize that as a weakness. So the information about the other country is less systematic, is less rigorous. However, of all bias I could have, it's not too bad. Not because Polish people are better than others, just because for logical reasons, for my argument, it's not such a bad thing. Thank you, but please add your criticism and make me think more about this.